In the early 1960s, the players on top came from down under. Australians such as Rod Laver, Roy Emerson, and Margaret Smith Court. They made major strides towards, well, more majors. At the same time, I also made a move in my own journalistic career when I left the Boston Herald for its crosstown rival, the Boston Globe.
Well, I grew up reading the Globe in central Massachusetts, in Groton, Massachusetts. So I was a sports fan, I was a Red Sox fan, and Bud did a lot of stories on the '67 Red Sox, and I saved those newspapers. So I was an 8th grader and holding on to the Boston Globes from the pennant race of '67. I was very starstruck to be around all the famous writers that we had here. No one was more famous than Bud Collins, and nobody was better to the young people than Bud Collins. He always had time for you, he had a joke for you, he treated you like an equal. We were awestruck by this guy, and he was such a good guy to everybody. So it was sort of a lesson as a young writer to learn to try to be nice to the young people later on, but nobody connected with the entire office more than Bud.
Well, I'd always wanted to be a sports writer, and the thing that actually saddens me now about Bud is people don't know what a great writer he was, writing about politics and boxing, and it wasn't just tennis. So I was completely aware of his work in the Boston Globe, but I didn't really get to know him until I was working nights when I was at Boston College. And sometimes something would happen, and late at night he'd be in some place across the globe, and I started taking dictation. We would get into conversations, and we established a friendship. He said to me when we finally met, "Kid, we're gonna have to teach you how to dress." And I said, "Well, please don't make it like you." Then he had me over to the Andover shop in the blink of an eye, and all of a sudden I had a pair of green corduroy pants, which was really not my style.
In 1973, I was at Boston College along with the great Mike Lupica, and Mike came over to me and said, "Leslie, put something kind of nice on. We are going out with Bud Collins." I was going to be a sports writer. I wanted to be a sports writer, and I was so in love with the entire Boston Globe sports department. We all went to dinner, I think on Newbury Street or someplace, and then Bud subsequently, like a lot of people, he would send me postcards from around the world. Bud was so thoughtful and so special that maybe a month later I would get a little postcard, "Ciao Bella," from Rome.
Well, first of all, he's brilliant. He's extremely well-read. He knows something about everything, and it filtered into his work. But his humor is what always set him apart.
Bud was a very colorful writer, very flamboyant writer. His writing was like his pants. I mean, it was just very flowery. It was outrageous. He got away with stuff you couldn't do now.
When I first started going to Wimbledon, Bjorn Borg was so popular and great looking with the golden mane. When he would come on the court, all the girls would squeal. And Bud tried to write at Wimbledon, they burst into squeals of Borgasms.
He would kind of take a piece of maybe the ethnicity of that player and use that for the nickname. Some of it might be considered too colorful or offensive now, but in those days it was just Bud having fun, and it was fun.
Bud was as comfortable writing about the mayor of Boston as he was about boxing. He went to big fights.
People forget the guy covered Muhammad Ali. He covered the Vietnam War. He went to South Africa with Arthur Ashe to try and have discussions about apartheid.
He had this career apart from tennis, and then tennis obviously made him this unique figure.
If the phones were ringing in the sports department, he would just pick up the phone and say, "Globe Sporting," and carry on a conversation with whatever this caller was probably calling in to find out, settle a bet about boxing or something like that.
He had an ability to make people feel like they were his friends. You got the idea that he'd been everywhere, and he knew everybody, and he hadn't forgotten anything.
Bud Collins is an observer. He is an observer of life and a chronicler of life. He's really no less than a Mark Twain of our era.
I can't imagine what my life would have been like if I'd never met Bud, apart from all the great things he did for me in my career.
Incredible stories there. We know about all the nicknames that Bud had back in the day. Tracy, what was your nickname and what'd you think of it?
I don't know. I liked it. It was the Tracer. So he wrote to me these kind words in his encyclopedia. Yeah, I mean, it was the Belleville Basher for Jimmy Connors. It was the Barcelona Bumblebee for Arantxa Sanchez Vicario. It was Fraulein Forehand for Steffi Graf. Fingers Fortescue for the guy. Remember the guy who used to stand or sit at the net and call the lets? So that's what Bud was about. He was witty. He was charismatic. And remember, when he came into tennis, it was kind of a kind of, I don't want to say a bland sport, but he made it more energetic, and he brought the personalities out. He made it come alive with his writing. And it was all, I remember one thing he wrote about Kornikova. I don't think this could happen today. Someone asked, why was she on the cover of a magazine? He said, because her backside was better than her backhand. So I don't think that would go over too well today.
Definitely not. That was pretty racy. And, he was talking earlier about his pants were explosive in 1966. His pants stayed explosive even all the way to 2013 when Djokovic saw them and mentioned something on them. And it takes a certain amount of self-confidence to walk around in the outfits that he was wearing. And he was a personality. He was a guy that didn't conform with everybody else. And there's something to be said about that from a personal standpoint. Learn how to stand out. And Bud Collins definitely stood out.
Jan, Mike, what have you learned about Bud today that you didn't know?
Oh, there's two of me right there. Just this whole story, I've really enjoyed. Last night I watched the story myself, kind of prepping for today's show, and I was actually emotionally moved a couple times. Tears were in my eyes, just how kind of his early beginnings and going into the sport, his love for flair, the way that he treats people. I love hearing the stories of other players who have interacted with him, because they're very much about the same as how my stories with him and how he treated me so kindly. Tracy said he knew everybody. He did know everybody, and everybody kind of wanted to be his friend. And he was like that neighborhood kind of guy that I really like the Mark Twain reference. I feel like he could be a modern Mark Twain.
All right, I'm going to go back to the tracer now. Our boss said, Ken Solomon said, there is no tennis channel without Bud Collins. I mean, how much did he mean to journalism and tennis?
Wow. He was right at the beginning of when tennis came to television, and they plucked this journalist out, and luckily it was Bud Collins who had this charisma. And I don't remember it, but apparently he started on PBS with Donald Dell, and it was on Monday nights throughout the summer. And it kind of drew in the public who hadn't really watched much tennis, and tennis was on so rarely. And of course, Donald was the straight man with all the facts, and then Bud would, as Dan O'Shaughnessy said, he made it flowery, he made it interesting, he made it entertaining. And I think that's why NBC plucked Bud from CBS in 1972 and said, we want you to be the face of breakfast at Wimbledon. And then, of course, the pants came into play, and he's the historian. Everybody goes to Bud for everything about tennis, all the way back to Suzanne Lungland. He had an incredible memory. And this is the ode to Bud, just in case everybody forgets. This was his wife when he passed away. She gave a Bud a bow tie to a few different people, and I'm honored to wear it.
Tennis was lucky enough to have Bud as a reporter, but also he had a way with words. And so once he came to television, he sort of set the stage beautifully for the combatants that were in tennis. And luckily enough for tennis, early in the 70s, all of a sudden we got some personalities in the game. Tennis was never a popular sport in those days. And even when I started playing tennis, I'm from Buffalo, New York. That's a rough and tumble sort of crowd. And tennis, you were a bit of a sissy in my time. That's what I was called, playing tennis. So McEnroe, Connors, those type of players sort of allowed the game to be accepted wildly. And Bud Collins helped, obviously, with the way he described the action.
Yeah, I think he really started what we do here at Tennis Channel and kind of bringing people, the fans, a little bit closer to the players. Hey, these people also have personalities off the court. Let's show these things. And that's one of the things that Bud did so well and started. There's a little bit more than just grit and determination and what we're seeing on the court to these pros. They're people too. And I think that brings even more fans to the game. It's a lot more interesting and add a little color. And Bud was so fantastic at doing that, and always in a positive way. That's the thing that I love so much about him.
He helped to bring the game alive. Well,